The galaxy had long forgotten the value of mercy. Among the endless constellations ruled a coalition of species that worshipped dominance above all else, a hierarchy built on cruelty. In this order, humans were tolerated only as tools, lesser beings pressed into labor, treated as curiosities when docile, and pests when they showed pride. Alien warlords, adorned in armor forged under alien suns, strode across colonies believing their presence alone was law. To them, humanity was a species of fragile bodies and fleeting lifespans, incapable of defiance. That assumption lingered like rust on steel, persistent, corrosive, and soon to prove fatal. In the shadows of one occupied world, a father walked beside his son, their steps measured, their posture deliberate. The man's frame was wiry from toil, but his eyes burned with the quiet calculation of someone who had seen too much and yielded too little. His son was younger, untouched by the wear of servitude, his gaze still bright with questions. The father had kept that brightness alive, protecting it with patience, with whispered stories of what humans once were before the yoke of alien boots. He told his boy that strength was not only muscle or weaponry but the ability to stand unbent when the universe demanded submission. The settlement where they lived reeked of imposed order. Towers of alien design pierced the sky, their geometry cold and alien, while patrols of armored soldiers kept streets hushed. Markets bustled with conquered species, each moving carefully, as if the very air was rationed. The galactic soldiers, the enforcers of this empire, patrolled like predators. Their armor glistened black and gold, their weapons holstered with arrogance. They lived to remind others of their place, and humiliation was their chosen currency. The boy asked questions his father rarely answered directly. Why were humans always watched? Why were they never allowed beyond the settlement walls? Why did others laugh at their fragility? The father would offer only fragments, because the powerful fear what they cannot understand, because chains are forged not only of metal but of belief, because sometimes survival demands waiting until the enemy forgets you have teeth. It was wisdom born of restraint, but the embers of defiance never died in his chest. They waited, smoldering, for the spark. That day, the streets were crowded with both the downtrodden and the domineering. Traders shouted in guttural alien tongues, the stench of spice and oil thick in the air. The boy clutched a trinket carved from scrap, an object of no value save that he had made it himself. He held it tightly, as if proof that creation could still exist in a place built on destruction. His father allowed himself a fleeting smile, though he quickly masked it. Pride, even silent, could draw unwanted eyes. It was then the soldier noticed them. He was taller than most, his armor etched with symbols of conquest, a veteran drunk on the certainty of his superiority. He moved through the crowd like a storm-given flesh, scattering those too slow to step aside. His gaze fell on the boy not with curiosity, but with disdain. Children were reminders of continuity, of futures unbroken by conquest, and he despised the sight. The soldier's shadow loomed, blocking the sun, and he sneered down at the pair. His voice, amplified by the modulation of his helmet, carried the tone of someone addressing property rather than people. He mocked the boy's size, his frailty, his very existence. Laughter from nearby aliens followed, the kind that tightened throats and quickened pulses. The boy's grip on his trinket faltered, and in that moment the father's hand brushed his shoulder, steadying him without words. He would not allow shame to take root in his son, not while he drew breath. The alien leaned closer, as if daring neither human to speak. Silence stretched, brittle and taut. The father's jaw clenched, his every instinct screaming for stillness. Defiance too soon would mean death, and death without purpose was nothing but waste. Yet the air was charged, thick with a tension that seemed to vibrate between the three of them. The soldier sensed it, mistaking it for fear. He smiled the way predators smile before the kill. Then came the act that would ignite more than the soldier could comprehend. With the casualness of brushing dust from a sleeve, his armored hand lashed outward. The sound cracked across the market, the sound of flesh meeting force, of power wielded without consequence. The boy staggered, his head snapping to the side, his trinket falling from numb fingers onto the dust. For an instant, the world went silent. Even the traders ceased their cries. The strike was more than a blow. It was a declaration that one species could do as it pleased to another, and no one would dare stop it. The father's eyes followed the trinket as it rolled to a stop. In that tiny object lay hours of his son's joy, the fragile innocence he had fought to preserve. Now it lay abandoned in the dirt, sullied by cruelty. He lifted his gaze back to the soldier, and something ancient stirred. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the awakening of instincts long buried beneath survival. Every humiliation endured, every insult swallowed, every lash of the Empire's whip culminated in that single instant. He did not move yet, but the decision was already made, carved into the marrow of his bones. The soldier's gauntlet hand lingered in the air, as if he relished the echo of the strike. The boy clutched his cheek, his eyes wide with disbelief, a single tear betraying pain he refused to voice. Around them, a ripple of silence broke into cruel amusement. Alien traders smirked, their mandibles clicking or tongues hissing in mock laughter. Some shifted uncomfortably, not out of sympathy but because the imbalance had been displayed so openly. To them, a child's humiliation was nothing more than spectacle, an affirmation of the natural order. The father's chest rose with measured breaths, each one an anchor to keep him from exploding where he stood. His fists trembled at his sides, the tendons tight, veins standing out like cords. The sting of the slap was not on his own flesh, but it seared his spirit as if he had been the one struck. He had endured years of degradation, but never had he been forced to watch it fall upon his son. Rage stormed within him, a furnace threatening to burst through his ribs, yet he held still. He knew the rules of survival. One step too soon, and he would be cut down before meaning could be made of his defiance. The soldier mistook the stillness for weakness. He turned toward the gathered crowd, spreading his arms as if demanding applause for his cruelty. His voice thundered from within the helmet, declaring humanity pathetic, incapable of dignity, good only for servitude. He taunted the boy directly, asking if pain would teach obedience faster than words. His cruelty was not directed only at the child but at every human within earshot. The act was designed to remind all who witnessed that no matter how hard they clung to scraps of pride, it could be stripped away with a single strike. The boy stood frozen, his cheek reddened, his breathing shallow. Yet his eyes did not lower. Though fear burned in them, shame did not take hold. He looked at his father, searching, uncertain of what to expect, but also unwilling to cower before the brute. That single act of not bowing his head carried more weight than the soldier realized. It was defiance in its rawest form, not the roar of rebellion but the quiet refusal to surrender dignity. The father caught that look, and his resolve hardened further. He saw in his son the spark he had fought to preserve through years of oppression. That spark was now threatened not by hunger, not by toil, but by the hand of a soldier who thought cruelty was law. He could not allow the boy's courage to be smothered here in the dust of the market. He would not let his son's lesson be that humanity exists only to endure. Around them, voices rose again. Some aliens jeered, demanding the father kneel and beg for forgiveness on behalf of his child. Others laughed and clapped, feeding the soldier's ego. Even those who pitted said nothing, for silence was easier than risk. The atmosphere thickened with expectation. All eyes watched the father, waiting to see him broken. It was not only his son's dignity at stake but the dignity of every human who walked those streets. The soldier turned back to him with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment. He leaned close, his helmet nearly brushing the man's face, and delivered his final insult, that humans were cattle, unfit for respect, unworthy of freedom. His voice dripped with certainty, as though his words themselves were iron law. He expected nothing in return, no resistance, no spark, no danger. For in his arrogance, he believed a human's silence was as permanent as the stars. The father's breath steadied. His body no longer trembled from restraint but from the weight of choice. Every humiliation he had been endured for survival, but this moment was different. This was not about himself but about the boy standing beside him, eyes filled with questions, heart demanding an answer. What would it mean if he stayed silent now? What lesson would he leave carved into his son's memory? The soldier straightened, dismissing them both as beneath his notice, as if the matter were already closed. That single gesture revealed his fatal miscalculation. He had not only struck a child but declared before witnesses that humanity was incapable of response. By turning his back, he sealed his fate, for there are wounds pride cannot swallow, and there are moments when survival demands more than patience. The boy bent, retrieving his trinket from the dust with trembling hands. As he lifted it, its surface scratched and dulled. He looked again at his father. The object had survived the blow, but it bore scars it would carry forever. The father saw it too and understood. His son's innocence would not return, but what replaced it could be forged into something stronger, if he acted. The soldier laughed once more, already preparing to leave, secure in his superiority. The crowd murmured, some disappointed the entertainment was ending. But within the father's chest, the decision was complete. The slap had not just wounded his son's flesh. It had broken the last barrier restraining him. What came next would no longer be humiliation borne in silence. It would be the answer to an empire that believed humans had no teeth. The moment balance shifted, time itself seemed to stretch. The father's stillness ended with an eruption of motion so sudden that the crowd gasped as one. There was no hesitation, no warning, only the clarity of a man who had chosen, and in that choice discovered freedom. His hand rose with the precision of instinct honed not by training but by necessity, every muscle acting in unison. The strike landed with such force that it cracked through the soldier's armored helm as though it were brittle clay. A wet, concussive sound followed, abrupt and horrifying, echoing across the marketplace like the toll of a bell. Shock froze the spectators. They had expected submission, maybe another plea for mercy. What they witnessed instead was a human, dismissed as weak, reducing one of their enforcers to silence in a heartbeat. The soldier's body staggered backward, legs buckling, the arrogance strained as life fled. His skull had not merely been struck, it had been shattered. Bone gave way beneath human fury, a sound and sight so visceral that even hardened warriors flinched. The father stood over the crumpling figure, chest heaving with controlled breaths, eyes burning with something rawer than anger. This was not just violence. It was a statement carved in blood. No matter how low humanity was forced, there existed a boundary that, once crossed, would unleash consequences no oppressor could contain. His hand trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he had done. Centuries of mockery condensed into a single action that could not be undone. The boy stared at his father with awe and terror mingling, his young mind struggling to process what had just unfolded. The figure who had always spoken of patience, of waiting, of biding time, had revealed another truth, that patience was not weakness but restraint, and restraint could shatter into ferocity when the moment demanded. In that instant, the boy understood more than any lesson whispered in the dark, that humanity's strength did not lie in submission but in the refusal to accept humiliation when all else was stripped away. Around them, the market broke into chaos. Some aliens stumbled back in horror, their voices sharp with panic, while others shouted in rage, demanding vengeance. Soldiers on the perimeter reached for weapons but hesitated, their confidence rattled by what they had seen. The idea that a human, a frail, unarmored laborer, had destroyed one of their enforcers with bare hands cracked the certainty that underpinned their control. Fear, once reserved only for the oppressed, now bled into the eyes of the oppressors. The father's gaze swept across them, and for the first time in their lives, they saw no submission there. His presence carried a gravity that words could not replicate. He had not spoken, yet his act thundered louder than any speech. The message was clear: humans were not harmless, not broken, not incapable of violence. They were dangerous precisely because they had endured so much without breaking. The fallen soldier twitched once before lying still, his armor dented, his helm collapsed inward like ruined metal. The sight seared into the minds of every witness, human and alien alike. Some humans in the crowd lifted their heads higher, eyes widening with a spark they had thought forever extinguished. In their faces was recognition. One of them had proven the impossible, and nothing the Empire claimed about human fragility could erase what had just happened. The father shifted his stance, placing himself slightly ahead of his son, shoulders squared, every line of his body daring another soldier to test him. His breath came steady now, his fury no longer hidden but controlled, directed. He had not acted for spectacle, nor for rebellion. He had acted for his son, yet the result had spilled far beyond a single family. What was meant to be another routine humiliation had become a fracture in the Empire's illusion of dominance. The crowd buzzed with whispers, fragments of disbelief carried like sparks in dry grass. Some called it madness, others called it courage. But beneath both was a thread of fear, fear of what humans might become if more fathers chose as this one had. The Empire had always believed humanity's strength was limited by fragile bodies. Now it was forced to reckon with the truth it had overlooked, that willpower, sharpened by years of degradation, could turn even a bare hand into a weapon of annihilation. The boy's trinket, scratched and dirty, rested once more in his hand. He clutched it tightly, no longer with the innocence of a child but with the weight of memory. He would remember the sound, the silence that followed, the way every alien had looked at his father with sudden caution. That memory would not fade, it would grow, passed along like fire from torch to torch. The father had given him more than protection. He had given him a story, a proof, that humans were not to be mocked without consequence. The body of the soldier at their feet was not just a corpse, it was a symbol. And in that symbol, humanity's place in the galaxy had shifted irreversibly. The body on the ground had not even cooled before the air fractured with shouts. Soldiers surged forward, weapons half drawn, their disciplined steps betraying unease. They had witnessed the impossible, and though their training screamed at them to reassert control, their instincts warned them that the balance of fear had shifted. The man who stood before them was unarmored, unarmed, and yet he had felled one of their kind in a heartbeat. To advance against him suddenly felt less like enforcement, and more like risk. The father did not retreat. His son remained at his side, and he stood as a barrier between the child and the storm gathering. His breathing was steady, his eyes unflinching, his posture radiating a defiance that had nothing to do with muscle. He knew there would be consequences. He knew the Empire would not allow such a transgression to fade. But none of that mattered now, because what had been revealed could not be hidden again. The truth was out in the open. Humans could resist, and when pressed beyond endurance, they could kill. Around the perimeter, the gathered crowd wrestled with their own shock. Aliens who had jeered moments before now avoided his gaze. Some lowered their eyes, others retreated in silence, unwilling to risk standing too near. Fear cut both ways, and the spectacle of one soldier's skull crushed by a human hand gnawed at the myth of invincibility the Empire had built. A single act had undone years of propaganda, carving doubt into the hearts of even the most loyal subjects. Among the humans watching, a different current stirred. Where once their backs had bent instinctively, now some stood straighter, their eyes fixed on the father, as though he had carried out their unspoken vengeance. For years they had endured mockery, beatings, and degradation in silence. Now silence had been broken, and the echo of it spread through them like an awakening. Their chains had not fallen away, but in that moment they felt lighter, as though the weight no longer pressed quite so heavily. The soldiers tightened their formation. Their leader barked orders, calling for restraint of the human and punishment swift enough to erase the insult. Yet hesitation lingered. They had seen their comrade fall with a single blow, his head caved in despite his armor. They wondered, if they rushed this man, would he take another with him? The hesitation was only seconds long, but those seconds mattered. The crowd saw hesitation in the enforcers, and once seen, it could never be unseen. The Empire's perfect aura of control had cracked. The father's voice carried then, not a shout but a firm declaration. He told them plainly that no father could stand idle while his child was struck. His words were not polished, not the rhetoric of leaders, but they rang with a clarity that pierced deeper than any practiced speech. They cut through the noise and planted themselves in the hearts of those listening. The alien soldiers dismissed his words outwardly, but their unease deepened, for they knew strength when they heard it. This was not the whimper of the beaten. It was the roar of the provoked. The boy clung to his father's side, his cheeks still red but his expression transformed. Where pain had been, now there was fire. He looked at his father not only with love but with reverence. The lesson etched itself into him, not in gentle guidance but in the blood of an enemy. That moment would live in him forever, shaping his path long after the marketplace had been forgotten by others. From the edges of the crowd, whispers spread faster than any order could suppress. They spoke of the human who had destroyed a soldier, of the man who had refused humiliation. The story twisted into legend before their eyes, each retelling sharpening it further. Even as soldiers prepared to drag him away, the tale was already beyond their grasp. It would travel in hushed voices, whispered in the shadows of barracks and work camps, until it grew into something unstoppable. The father knew what awaited him. Execution, imprisonment, perhaps a lifetime of torment. Yet none of it weighed heavily upon him now. His act had already exceeded himself. He had not fought for rebellion, yet rebellion had been born in the hearts of those who watched. He had fought for his son, and in doing so, had given every human a glimpse of what it meant to defy. The dead soldier at his feet was no longer just a casualty. He was proof, undeniable and permanent, that humans were not fragile ornaments to be toyed with. They were capable of breaking their oppressors. That knowledge would outlive the father, outlive the boy, and ripple outward until no chain in the galaxy could hold them the same way again. The silence that followed was heavier than the clash of weapons. The father remained still, his stance unbroken, though the inevitability of what would come pressed upon him from all directions. Soldiers edged closer, compelled to act by duty but unsettled by what they had seen. Their armor gleamed, their weapons ready, yet the certainty that usually accompanied their presence had fractured. Each step they took forward carried hesitation, as though they feared the man before them might summon the same unstoppable force again. The father did not resist when they seized him. He had no illusions about his fate, but submission in chains was not the same as submission in spirit. His head remained high, his gaze fixed forward, daring any of them to mistake his capture for defeat. The boy was pulled away from him, struggling against the grip of another soldier. His cries were choked, but his eyes never left his father. That look was a bond stronger than any chain, a promise that this moment would not vanish into silence no matter how fiercely the Empire tried to erase it. The alien enforcers barked orders to clear the market. Fear of unrest drove them to scatter the witnesses quickly, but the damage was already done. Every creature present carried the memory burned into them, the sound of armor crushed beneath a human hand, the sight of a warrior falling lifeless, the defiance that radiated from a man who had been branded lesser all his life. Such images could not be scrubbed clean by proclamations or punishment. They would fester and grow in whispered retellings. For the humans, the event planted something dangerous. They had lived in shadows of despair, convinced resistance meant certain death without meaning. Yet here was meaning, carved in undeniable proof. A man had struck back and left his oppressor broken in the dirt. The act would travel faster than patrols could suppress, carried on lips in labor camps, in barracks, in the hushed corners where humans gathered. Each retelling would become sharper, bolder, until it ceased to be a story and became a rallying cry. Among the aliens, unease crept like a slow infection. They had been taught to see humans as frail, incapable of real threat, but one moment had upended that certainty. Doubt gnawed at their pride, and doubt was more corrosive than open rebellion. If a single human could crush a soldier's skull, what could many do if they ceased to bow their heads? The question lingered in the minds of commanders, a whisper that disrupted the illusion of absolute control. The boy, held tightly as his father was dragged away, clenched his trinket against his chest. The small object was no longer just a toy but a token of survival, a witness to transformation. He understood in his heart that his father's act was more than protection, it was a gift. It showed him that fear did not have to mean surrender, that strength could emerge even from those called weak. That truth embedded itself in him deeper than grief, and it would guide him long after this day was gone. The father's final words, spoken not in plea but in declaration, carried across the square. He promised that humanity would not remain broken forever, that what had begun here could not be silenced. His voice rang with conviction, and even as blows rained upon him, the echo lingered. It was not the voice of a desperate man but of one who had seen beyond himself, who had glimpsed the ripple his defiance would cause. As the enforcers dragged his body away, the marketplace shifted back to order, but the order was brittle. Beneath the surface, tension simmered, invisible but potent. The boy's tears dried on his face, replaced by the fire of resolve. The soldiers could separate him from his father, but they could not strip him of what had been given. That inheritance was not wealth or freedom but something far more dangerous: belief. In the years to come, the story would spread like flame. Some would call it myth, others exaggeration, but within every retelling lay a core of unshakable truth. Humans were not passive cattle. They could strike. They could kill. They could resist. Empires built on fear depend on the belief that resistance is impossible. The father had shattered that illusion with his bare hands. The legacy of that day would not rest with the man who acted, nor even with the boy who witnessed. It would belong to every human who heard the tale and straightened their spine a little higher, who whispered in the dark that they too could rise. And when rebellion finally came, it would not begin with an army, but with the memory of a single father who refused to bow when his son was struck, and in that refusal, gave humanity back its fire.